Hello, and welcome back to Boundless and Bottomless Sea's main show. It's crazy that this show, that's a sub show of 3 shows, has also sub shows. But anyway, um,
I'm sensing a pattern here, man. We do that when you're on our show too.
We're just trying to be dialectical. It's just everything's multiple strands, and they don't ever all become their own thing. They all have to come back at some point.
There's a
Yeah.
totality out there, but we haven't found it yet.
yeah. And we're going to speak in a heteroglossic manner for those of you who like grad school words, and talk about the entire hermeneutic circle of fourth political theory, which should be included in the fourth nomos of the earth, aka what is the subject of fourth political theory, which is das Sein, but not like das Sein as in the way it is often portrayed popularly, which is existential popular choice, but das Sein as in being and becoming in this nested way of which the individual also builds a collective Dasein, of which is some kind of ethnos, actually, in this case.
Yeah, as
To be honest, I kind of just feel like he's trying really hard to not draw conclusions that I think are just sort of easy to draw. And Dasein but is a slippery concept. I'm not yet convinced of anything.
Well, he falls back on what he calls Heidegger's mature period, which happened to coincide from 1936 to 1945.
You know, the period we don't talk about because, reasons. And not normally considered his mature period.
The period when everyone was on vacation.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens to the hermeneutic. Let me try to use his terms. The hermeneutic circle of the third political theory when you take race out and you replace it with ethnos.
Yeah. So let's get into a hermeneutic circle, because I actually explained this basic bitch linguistic / literary / epistemological concept, which is rooted in biblical criticism, actually originally, which is a way of reading a text. But here it's pretty clear that Dugin is using the text as the world itself. So the world is a text here, of which the interpretive framework that feeds back in this circle, and the circle is a feedback loop, is for him race. So he's done 2 things here. Okay. For those of you who've been paying attention to philosophical moves, he's actually done one that I've seen done on the post-structuralist left before, actually, which is to equate epistemology and ontology and textuality and textual interpretation measures with dialectical interpretation measures, because there's similarities in the language of grammar. And for those of you who are like, what the fuck are you talking about? This is actually pretty heady continental philosophical stuff. So hermeneutics, hermeneutics has a direct relationship to German idealism. It doesn't come out of German idealism exactly, but it actually comes out of the same kinds of people, the Bauers, critical biblical scholarship, who overlap with the left wing of Hegelianism. So it's not the first time this has been attempted. But to say that the subject of history is the same as a hermeneutic circle interpretive device is actually a pretty big claim. Commonly done in the 1970s and like post-structuralist stuff, but generally something we move away from now. And I think this is interesting because I think it kind of dates the book. Now, I actually do think hermeneutic circles are really important, because one of the things I complain about is Marxists pretend like Marx is hermeneutically clear, as if like just one clear interpretation, and we don't have to make any choices on what's canon, what do we prioritize over, what text do we prioritize over other text in our interpretation. In some ways, one of the great debates between the humanist Marxist and both the big M humanist with the hyphen and the little m humanist a la Gramsci and Khrushchev versus the structuralist Marxists is there's a lot of content claims. I'm not going to say it's just a hermeneutic claim, but part of it is a relatively simple hermeneutic debate about whether or not you accept all of Marxist theory and all times as internally consistent with each other. That's the Marxist humanist approach, particularly in the hyphen form of Rita Denskaya or CLR James, etc. And or if you have like the epistemic break of middle period Althusser, and I say middle period Althusser because late Althusser actually muddles that a bit. He starts having multiple epistemic breaks, mainly because Althusser actually read more Marx. When Althusser made the claim about the epistemic break, he was like familiar with like 9 pieces of Marx really intimately, and that was it. So
yeah, it seems like a good idea to read a lot of whatever you're going to critique, especially if you're going to make such a claim like that.
His philosophy was in such like a transitional period for like capital M Marxism, though, because so much was being translated and unearthed, and it was like kind of the beginning of the whole mega project. So, I mean, I give him
the second beginning of the whole mega project. I mean, the first beginning is in the 30s, and Stalin kills Resnick. So,
well, yeah, and you know, to give him a little bit of credit, like, he wasn't just doing this in isolation, like just an intellectual in isolation. Like, the Marxism of the French Communist Party was presented itself as in such a way as to be more totalizing than I think it should have, you know?
Yeah, and also he not literally didn't just do it by himself. I mean,
he's reaching for a book, folks. Hit the deck.
There's 5 names on the book.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I only know some of those names.
Yeah, so this is Althusser, Balabar, Roger Esteble, I think, Pierre Macquarie, and Jacques Rancière. And Rancière critiques Althusser. And then, you know, but I think it's interesting because that debate about the hermeneutics of Marx actually led to some of the stuff in post-structuralism. Foucault comes out of Althusser almost directly as a genealogical line. You know, you take Althusser and you strip out the Marxism basically and add something. And
right.
And you kind of start to see where Althusser's epistemes and archaeologies comes from. Now, for those of you who were not expecting a class on continental mid-20th century philosophy as popularized in the 2000s when this book was originally written, it's a good thing to remind yourself that the workerist left that we have today seemed all but dead in 2008 when this was written, and that this language would have been in these kinds of moves of equating things like this would have been pretty common in stuff like Mouffe, Lacroix, Hart, and Nagiri, stuff like that. I mean, you know, Sean KB, I'm sure I can have you have flashbacks about
absolutely
dealing with real subsumption, for example.
Yeah.
So, but I want to point out that there is a move here where subject and hermeneutic circle guidepost are becoming the same thing. And I don't think you can do that in because what that implies is in the second political theory, race is class is a hermeneutic circle for Marxism.
Right.
And in some ways it is, but in other ways it absolutely isn't. Hitler doesn't want to get rid of race. Right. Marx does want to get rid of class, so the function even is different.
Yeah, that's like typically forgotten. It's kind of glossed over. Like, the whole purpose of the proletarian dictatorship is to abolish itself, and I think that very few people have even conceptualized what that actually means.
I mean,
what he wants to get rid of, as we'll see, and this is around page 41 from my notes, is he wants to keep what's left of the second political theory, which is to say Marxism, communism, but get rid of the notion of historical materialism, get rid of the notion of progress, right? As we're going to see in the course of the third chapter, progress is a big bugbear for him because he wants to be relativistic and he also wants to be cyclical, and he wants there to be something left from the other three theories after you've taken away these essential hermeneutic parts to them.
All right, but to be fair to him, Baudrillard wanted to get rid of progress and Marxism. Christopher Lasch, from a completely different register, wanted to get rid of progress and Marxism.
I'm not saying he's de facto or a priori wrong about that. I just think he less, it seems like, and we'll get to this part, less wants to get rid of class per se. He wants to keep the critique of class society. He wants to get rid of class struggle.
Yeah, I mean, so he basically is, he's pretending that he's siding with a element of the second political theory, aka Marxism, but what he's actually doing is going to a prior unstated political theory, aka distributivism, integralism, which is the class struggle needs to be mitigated by a third or fourth thing, usually either the sovereign and sovereign exception, or the ethnos and the collective imaginary of the ethnos.
It's kind of a philosophy of right through the back door.
So let's get into this. But we see that he wants to, as early as on my book, page 22, we see he wants to get rid of the racism stuff. Now, I also want to point out that there have been fascists, and I've been pointing out this the whole time, who were actually uncomfortable with Hitlerism's biological racism, who were still fascists.
The Mussolini strain, right? Certainly in the first 15 years or so was a non-racial fascism. It's one of the main problems I have with him trying to get race out of fascism, but like still retain part of its critical element is that you don't even need race. You can just be Mussolini. You can be a Mussolinist. You can have the state instead of race. And never does he say we need to jettison the state from the third political theory.
So this is why I was talking about heteroglossia. Okay, for those, and I'm bringing in a non-Marxist. Well, actually, Bakhtin may be considered a Marxist. He's a Russian thinker who was not totally anathema in the Soviet Union. But he talks about heteroglossia, and heteroglossia is when something tells you multiple things that are in conflict with each other. So all voices are emerging. And I find this interesting that Dugin actually accepts a liberal mischaracterization of fascism so that he can distance his own post-fascism further from fascism classic. Because fascism classic and post-fascism are actually more related on the specific issues that he's talking about than he wants to let on. The difference between fascism classic and post-fascism, if we accept this sort of like distinction I'm using Enzo Traverso here, is that post-fascism does not actually require catastrophic induction of mass politics, which is actually the difference between fascism and post-fascism, not these things about the ethnos and the state and the integral state. Because we have to remind ourselves that in classical fascism, the ethno state is actually the subject of the politics as a whole. All right. So anyway, I'm going to just read here. If we begin fascism and National Socialism, then we must definitely reject all forms of racism. Now, he doesn't say why. Racism is what caused the collapse of National Socialism in historical, geopolitical, and theoretical sense.
I guess that's why.
I mean, but you know that's what that is why. But that's actually not saying anything. That's repeating itself. This is a philosophical tactic where you actually just restate what you said the first time in a different way and make it seem like that's actually an argument.
Right.
There is some information. Now we know that he thinks that racism and not say, I don't know, the Red Army is what defeated fascism.
War in general, right?
Right, yeah. This is not only a historical but also philosophical collapse. Racism is based on the belief in the innate objective superiority of one race over another. Now, we'll notice here that he hasn't defined race. All right. If racism and not some other aspect of National Socialism, and we've already shifted. There's a bunch of subtle shifts in here, and I want people to notice this. He shifted from fascism to just National Socialism, which indicates to me he actually does know what he's doing.
Yeah.
That brought about such a consequence, leading to the immeasurable suffering on both sides, as well as the collapse of Germany and the Axis powers. I guess that I can't decide if he thinks that's bad or not. Not to mention the destruction of the entire ideological project of the Third Way. The criminal practicing of wiping out entire ethnic groups, Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, based on race, was precisely rooted in their racial theory. This is what angers and shocks us about Nazism to this day. In addition, Hitler's anti-Semitism and the doctrine that Slavs are subhuman and must be colonized is what led Germany to go to war against the Soviet Union, which cost us millions of lives, us here being Russia. It is also true that this resulted in Germans themselves losing their political freedom and the right to participate in the political history for a long time, if not forever. Germany doesn't participate in political history now? Okay, cool. They are left only with their economy and, in the best sense, with a concern for ecology. Well, that's funny now. The supporters of the Third Way were left in the position of ideological outcasts on the margin of society. It was racism in theory and in practice that criminalized all of their aspects of National Socialism and fascism, causing these worldviews to become objects of curses and vilification. So we do have an argument. Basically, the argument is thus. The Red Army defeated the Axis powers because the Axis were racist against Slavs, and they probably should have been nicer to Jews too. That's the argument.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, yeah, and I think he doesn't quite say it, but I think we can deduce that because fascism failed, that it is bad.
Yeah.
That's this. It's not so much a moral argument. It's just that its time has passed and it hasn't given us anything. So the best we can do is assess whether or not there's anything good that comes from it. But to try to revive it, and he knows this from experience, it's not gonna get you anywhere.
No, this is where we go ahead.
It says a lot about his theory and understanding of the movement of history, of historical dynamics, that history ended for Germany, I guess, in 1945, when in reality, at least within like the liberal world system, the height of Germany's power really over the last 100 years or so, or at least after Hitler, might have been the 1990s and the 2000s, right? You have its influence in pulling together and supporting and building the constellation of capitalist forces that make up the European Union.
There's a reason why I refer to the Fourth Reich.
Right.
So, like,
so Germany's got this world-spanning, like high value-added, high-value export economy that like pulls up, hundreds of millions of other people in the world, but that's not history though, right? That's them being subjected and subordinated to, in his mind, the place where nothing happens, where no history happens, which is liberalism, right? This sort of
right, because if you regard the liberal world order as a decadent and past its time, it doesn't matter anymore. It's also definitely driven primarily still from the United States, anyways. So Germany is just fairly successful in hitching its wagon to on the wrong cart or whatever.
Like the most successful vassal state of the United States.
Yeah. I think he could probably do a better job of articulating this, but I don't think it's entirely
no, I think
it's not entirely
If someone's got Hegel brain, it's not entirely a stupid argument.
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly right.
I guess we're all a little Hegel brained in here.
The dialectic of Hegel brain and Varn's like deep distrust of Hegelianism. It's funny. Jason, Jason, I suggested reading the McGee book on Hegel, and you're like, yes, I agree with that book, and this is why I'm now more of a Hegelian. And I was like, no, that's not what I meant.
That's true. That book is responsible for an entirely new trajectory in my
an
political
epistemological break.
Yeah,
actually, yeah.
The regrettable century epistemological break was me like, hey, Hegel's really religious, and you guys going, yes, and then I'm like, but that's not what. Okay, I guess you
were
agree
like, yes. Yes, he is. Yes, he was indeed, and also so am I now.
Anyway, but I actually think this next paragraph is interesting because it's actually weirder, and I'm going to read it. We can parse this, and we'll move on from the sectional race. Hitler's racism, however, is only one form of racism.
Oh, here we go. He's like, he's doing a boomer thing now, where he's like, you know, an N-word's a state of mind. You know, it's not a racial thing.
This type of racism is the most obvious, straightforward, and biological, and therefore the most repulsive. There are other forms of racism. Now, I'm going to get back to this because I don't see how some of these other forms of racism are not also expressed in his ethnos stuff later. Cultural racism, asserting that there are high and low cultures. God, he sounds fucking liberal here. Yeah. Civilizational, dividing people into the civilized and those insufficiently civilized. Technological, viewing technological development as the main criterion for the value of society. Social, stating in the spirit of the Protestant doctrine and predestination that the rich are the best and the greatest compared to the poor. And that makes more sense if you think about stuff that was being said in 2008 in America. Like that was a much more common sentiment. Now even conservatives don't really say that anymore. I guess when you release there as decadent as ours are, you can't maintain that. Economic, in which all of humanity is ranked according to the degree of material well-being, and evolutionary, for which it is axiomatic that human society is a result of biological development, in which the basic processes of the evolution of the species, survival of the fittest, natural selection, and so on continue today.
Very common racism today.
Yeah. European and American societies are fundamentally afflicted with these types of racism, unable to eradicate them from itself despite extensive efforts. And those efforts are going to get more extensive after this book was published, to be fair. Yeah. Being fully aware of how revolting this phenomenon is, the people in the West tend to make racism a taboo. However, all this turns into a witch hunt. New pariahs are accused of fascism, are its victims, often for no apparent reason. Now, this sounds defensive as fuck. Yeah. You guys accuse people being fascist for no reason. Now, I will also say, yes, people accuse people being fascist. I mean, this is the problem that we have now with category inflation. And this is one of these times where I actually both got really annoyed with the debates around Danny Besner talking about how the Confederacy is not fascist because fascism doesn't exist yet, even if there's elements of the Confederacy that are in fascism. To say that it is fascist is to retroject a fully articulated political philosophy before it was fully articulated. It'd be like me saying that 12th century kings and Moravia were liberals because they had markets or something.
Because what it's doing is it's basically denying history as any kind of process. It's just one or another sentiment that takes control of people, but it's basically all the same. And that history is it's basically just a story of back and forth between competing ideologies, but there's never any development.
There's these ideal forms that exist throughout human history.
Yeah.
Kind of pop into reality and then pop out.
So if I was going to attack Western liberalism, I would attack the fact that its atomized individualism has actually led it to an ahistoricism that pretends that, for example, that symbolic kinship mediation, something that I really study, is the same whether we're talking about a tribe, a marriage, or a fucking nation state. That that because they're symbolic kinship relation, that's true. That they're the same because of the basis of the symbolic mediation being, there. And I'm just like, scale fucking changes content eventually.
There's the whole
So
argument about quantity and quality and all that, for a
yeah.
reason.
I mean, yeah. Maybe Hegel, for all of my he was religious talk, had a point about something. I don't know. Maybe quantity and quality become one thing at certain points. But anyway, the uh, I think that's interesting because if I wanted to attack the contradictions of American liberalism today, it's that atomized individualism has led to a scenario where we both talk about being on the right side of history, a necessarily Whiggish concept that history has a fucking right side,
Right.
and in which it is currently always progressing towards more civilizational humaneness or some shit.
Yeah. The moral arc bending towards justice.
Yeah. Dumb shit that Steven Pinker thinks. And also a lot of leftists will use that language without thinking about it, and also rejecting any historical distinctions as being substantive. This is actually kind of endemic to historical education right now, where we assume that you can go from micro to macro history, so the study of individual small events, to the study of large-scale movements, and not draw up any systems, because systems are not something that historians do. That's an interpretive lens, and we're going to avoid that because the 20th century was bad or some shit.
Right.
Usually is the argument, more or less. And my historian friends are going to get mad at me, but there are trends that try to buck this. There's new materialism, which by that I mean just people trying to bring back Marxian thinking into historiography. There is Cleodynamics. There is people applying models from anthropology back into history, but by and large, this position that is implicit in Dugin, particularly in 2008, was not an odd position for a leftist or liberal to have, and I want to point that out. Which makes their Whiggishism even weirder and more schizophrenic. And I think that leads to some of the, quote, witch huntiness that he's talking about. But Dugin's not, for all of his intellectual sophistication at points, and I do want to give him credits. I know he's an irrationalist, but he does have a very sophisticated argument set. He actually doesn't go there. Maybe it's easier to articulate now. I don't know. I don't know if I would have said that in 2008. It's harder for me to put myself back into the mindset of even 16 years ago, but still. Okay, getting back. This is where he sounds like, I mean, I could hear this coming out of Tucker Carlson's mouth, honestly. The new pariahs accused of fascism are its victims for apparently no reason. Thus, this very political correctness. Now we'd now say wokeness, because wokeness is even shorter than political correctness. And if you're a troglodyte, you can get it out easier. And its norms are transformed into a totalitarian discipline of political, purely racist exclusions. In this manner, the institutionalized French left liberal anti-racism has gradually become a distribution center of racial hatred. This is interesting and actually, I think, somewhat correct. He's talking about laicism in France. That's what he's talking about here. Even Africans suffer for being accused of fascism. He's talking about
you see a lot around the debates about immigration to Sweden and Germany, France, and Italy days, right?
Yeah, and we saw a lot of it. If you think about the arguments around the end of the New Atheists, this was common back then too.
Islamofascism, right?
Right, yeah. In this manner, the institutionalized left liberal anti-racism has become the distribution of hatred. Even Africans suffer from being accused of fascism. Such was the case as an unrestrained defamatory campaign against a well-known black comedian.
You don't
French
name
name.
French African name.
French name Mbala, who dared. It's easy. It's funny to me that the African name is easier for me to say than the French name.
I think I would pronounce this Dildon.
Diodon Mbala, or Diodone Mbala, one way or the other. All right. Who dared to mock certain hideous features of contemporary French establishment in his routine, including
including anti-racism.
Including anti-racism, which I think, to be fair, we're seeing again.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah, honestly, this could be written from by about this year rather than 2008.
Yeah, I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. The very ideology of progress is racist in its structure. Actually, this I've heard from leftists as well. I have, like, not contemporary leftists, but when I was in college in the aughts, this was a common argument that the Enlightenment was inherently racist because the idea of progress is inherently racist because you can't, like, the necessary, like, progress, like, excludes the African tribe. And I'm gonna say I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to this argument. I don't think it's totally full of shit even. The assertion that the present is better and more fulfilling than the past, and the continual reassurances that the future will be even better than the present, are discriminations against the past and the present, as well as the humiliation of all those who lived in the past, an insult to the honor and dignity of our ancestors and those of others, and a violation of the rights of the dead. Okay, now,
I kind of think that's right.
It's like
I mean, I don't think there's rights of the dead, but other than that, I agree with him.
Even the safe, like that Benjamin messianic Marxism.
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah.
In many cultures, the dead play an important sociological role. Okay, we're gonna get into hauntology stuff. This is gonna be fun. I'm actually somewhat serious. Like, hauntology is all fun and games till you remember that it starts off talking about literal ghosts. Only Derrida makes it about metaphorical ones. In many cultures, the dead play an important sociological role. Absolutely true. They are considered to still be alive in a certain sense, present in the world, and participating in life. True. This is true of all ancient cultures and civilizations. Not willing to say that, actually. Yeah. I'm actually not willing to say that. But most, if you said most and not all, I would still agree with it. Billions of inhabitants on this earth believe in on this concept to this day. That's not an argument, though. That's just an assertion. Right. In Chinese civilization, which is built upon the cult of the dead and upon the reverence alongside the living, being dead is regarded as a high social status, in some way superior to the status of the living. In which Chinese civilization?
Yeah, I don't know.
Like, there's a bunch of them.
Certainly, Kim Il-sung it has a high social position in North Korea right now.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways in which he could just moderate or soften a little bit of his arguments, and it would make them go down a lot easier.
Yeah.
But he doesn't.
Yeah, and also I would point out that, again, I've heard all these arguments from post-structural leftists in the aughts. I have. Yeah. I mean, like I've actually, what's interesting to me reading this book, and I remember reading it back then, I'm like, oh, this is picking up on left language and right-wing language, like the rights of the dead and, like, the vote for our ancestors. Like, if you know that's from, like, Chesterton and Orthodox Christian circles and stuff.
Oh, okay.
Like, that's even like Burke, like, institutions matter because the past gets the vote. Like, that's a Burkean conception. All right. So again, when people don't know their conservatism or other forms of leftism that are not even that long gone, like, some of this rhetoric is going to fly over them, I think. Although I think this is pretty, other than the fact it's, like, a little bit too confident in self-assertion, I agree with Jason. I agree with, like, half this paragraph. I mean, like I do. The ideology of progress represents the moral genocide of past generations. Okay, now that's some, in other words, the real racism. Aha! now we got the rhetoric of reality. And as
affirmative,
I feel like an editor could have helped a lot in the final publication of this. Because, like, some things, like, in other words, real racism, I would, could just strike that.
Yeah,
you don't need to say that.
He's a polemicist, though, right? He's not just
this is like when like, I hate to say it, but this is a basic move. Is like, like when the Republicans were against slavery, therefore the modern Republicans are the real anti-racist because of what Abraham Lincoln did and Horace Greeley did 150 years ago.
It's a real amateur move. I don't know.
Yeah, I would also say, like, That would also make the GOP the real Marxist, because Horace Greeley was a person publishing Marx in the United States. But whatever. All right. Equally questionable is the idea of modernization, which is often taken as a self-evident virtue. It is easy to detect the obvious signs of racism in it. You know what? Christopher Lashkid wrote that. He wouldn't have said the real racism, but the rest of this is true. And he was actually using it to defend populism against accusations of being racist and defend Martin Luther King as a key American thinker. So, make of that what you will. Undoubtedly, racist is the idea of a unipolar globalization. Okay, this is where I'm sort of like,
This is where he's basically making the claim that universalism, and Enlightenment principles, especially bourgeois principles, are in themselves.
So the first political theory is really the third political theory the whole time, which a lot of Marxists would believe too, but nonetheless,
I kind of think that if you just wouldn't talk about it as like inherently racist, and instead he just talked about it as driving racism, and this concept is a concept, and racism is also a concept, and the second concept thrives upon the first, but the first does not necessarily give rise to the second one. Just a little bit of nuance,
Yeah, a little bit of like overuse of the monologic is. Which, to be fair to him, fuck if I don't see this all the time and everything else. I mean, we remember the post-Ex Kendi discourse where like X policy is racist because it's not explicitly about undoing racism.
Right.
So like stuff like universal welfare that's not racially equated is actually racist because it is not about undoing racism, even if it would have the results of undoing racial disparity. That's an actual Abraham X. Kendi argument, and that's the same kind of thing that our bro here Dugin's doing. And I just point that out.
That's the argument that Hillary Clinton used against Barack Obama.
Yeah. So, I mean, I point that out because, like, some of these moves that we say are like, yeah, this is bad and stupid. It is. But, like, I also think we need to admit that there's a lot of left thinkers who get a pass for making the exact same structural move. Like, X is Y because I fucking feel because X produces Y, therefore they must really be the same thing. And that's not, and that's why I'm using, analytic logic to explain this. That's not true. Like, you can't say, like, I have a baby, the baby is me because we are of the same essence because I had the baby. Like, that's what you would be doing, right? That's not a valid argument. The baby is not me. Like,
but presumably he knows better, right? So he's using this.
I don't know. This is where I don't know that he does. I mean, like, because this is super common. Like, Abraham S. Kendi doesn't really know better. Like, I've listened to him talk. He's not a guru. I mean, he's obviously not very effective at managing an academic department, but he's not a guru. In the sense that I don't think he was just coming up with something that was gonna make him money. Although that may be what it came up with. I think he really believed what he said. And similarly here, I think we're gonna get. I think this is gonna get really weird when we get into his ethnos stuff, right?
I mean, one of the problems here is that Dugin has such an encyclopedic knowledge that he seems as though he definitely knows everything, and that means anything that I disagree with or that we disagree with or whatever seems like that's sleight of hand. But you can't actually know everything, so he might only know a little bit about the stuff that he references.
Right. Well, I mean, that's going to be the great question of this book: is when is he bullshitting or not?
Right.
And I often don't know. Like, I'm like, okay, is this a bullshit argument? Because we've talked about, like, he makes like left liberal internet arguments made by Americans and states them to Russians as if they are objectively true.
Yeah.
Like remember what he said about George Bush being a dominionist and shit like that. It was just
thank God for the Iraq War or something like that. I don't remember him ever saying that. I don't know. Maybe he did, but no, I feel like this extended excursion into the liberals are the real racists and that progress is racist. Move feels to me like ass covering. I don't know. I mean, this is him wanting to have his fascism, but like cleaned up of all of the parts that made the Nazis lose, but also pointing a finger and saying the anti-fascists are the real fascists.
Right. Which
Real race.
Well, and what he could do is he could make a very clear and simple argument that draws a line from the Protestant Reformation to the discovery of the New World, to the transatlantic slave trade, to the rise of modern biological racism, and how that all informs the Nazi project. And he could say that's all liberalism, but instead he makes it, he cuts off that part of history and he makes the argument about, liberalism right now.
Because this is a move that he does through the entire book. I think we complained through several probably of the first 3 episodes of this little mini series here about how history never really enters into his domain, like historical trajectories and dynamics. There's like these theories, which are these ideas, which are these bodies of thought, which then like appear in the world and continue on, and then some of them die off and then some of them continue. But if you're looking for like a real historical structural argument like you just gave, Dugin's not here for that shit, right?
Because it would smell too much like Whiggish history for him to say that anything has logics and progressions. And notice I say logics and progressions, not progress, big P, because like capital has a logic of which it developed. Does that mean that it's morally better than everything before it? No.
Well, another reason why he strays away from this is because it would smack too much of communist thought, which he's trying to reject entirely.
Because at least on that historical materialism, this mechanistic idea of history, as he sees it, right, is what needs to be discarded from the second theory.
Right.
Look, I think mechanistic historical materialism has big fucking problems. I mean, I want to be on the record for that, but I'm not sure that mechanistic historical materialism is actually the correct interpretation of what Marx and Engels meant.
Well, I'm reading this too. When I was reading this for today's session, I reminded myself too where Dugin learned his Marxism from.
Yeah, that's important.
Important.
Yeah, that's true. Late Soviet historical materialism was pretty shitty.
Oh yeah, vulgar as fuck, mechanistic as fuck.
One of its essential features of fourth political theory rejects all forms and varieties of racism and all forms and varieties of normative hierarchization of societies based on ethnic, religious, social, technological, economic, and or cultural backgrounds. Basically, you can't judge cultures against other cultures, motherfucker. So the Russian way, the Ruski mir, is just as good as your Atlantic worldview. Suck it. That's what he's arguing. Now, we could argue like, the question is by what do you mean by fucking good? But good at, you need to add those propositions and prepositions to those words for them to be meaningful, but nonetheless. Such an assessment is always subjective, so is everything. And any attempt to raise a subjective assessment of the status of a theory is racism. That is some Abraham X. Kendi move. Like any attempt to raise a subjective assessment to a status of a theory is racism. That's a broader claim of racism than any critical race theorist has ever made.
Yeah, it's also just like, it's just too easy. It's just too bogus and so obviously bogus. Again, it's just like, I don't think you needed to make that argument.
Yeah.
He doesn't see, the United States as the product of, bourgeois revolution. He doesn't see it as like a political process worked out in the course of the working out of class society. He doesn't understand capital as having this like forward moving dynamic, doesn't understand like how it was that Anglo-American civil liberties like came to be out of the class structure of that period. He instead sees, and this is I think important, he sees the neoliberal world order, or the unipolar American hegemony, as an artificial, he says it directly, an artificial imposition on the rest of the world of very specific ethnic values of Anglo-Saxon people, whether they be on one side of the Atlantic or the other, right? So we need to be very clear about that, right? That he's not looking at these in terms of like universal or enlightenment values or bourgeois values. Instead, it's a very, very real instantiation of like a particular ethnos that's being like pushed upon the Russian people, for example.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
now we're going to get into where he shows his cards again. The central axiom of fourth political theory. Furthermore, if anti-racism is directly opposed the ideology of National Socialism, in other words, the third political theory, then it also indirectly attacks communism with this class hatred, because class hatred is racism.
Racism, yeah, absolutely. That's like saying if you say fuck the police, you're being racist, right?
Yes.
Blue
I mean,
lives matter, for
Yeah.
example.
But actually, according to that criterion, any attempt to raise a subjective acceptance to a status of a theory, not even status of a scientific fact, to a status of a theory is racism. So yes, blue lives matter, and also all anarchist lives matter, because if you were to argue one or the other, those are both racisms. This is an like the extremity of this relativism and what is being branded as racism. I mean, like I said, it would make Abraham X. Kendi and DiAngelo blush. Like, it's a way bigger claim. Like, and as well as liberalism with its progressivism, as well as inherent forms of economic, technological, and cultural racism. Instead of a unipolar world, the first political theory insists upon a multipolar world. This, by the way, I'm sorry for people who want to argue with me that they didn't get this obsession with multipolarity, which is a British geopolitical strategy that was talked about by Fareed Zakaria and other American geopolitical center-right liberals in the middle of the aughts. The reason why it magically came back and leftists are using it is Dugin. I do not. You can claim what you want to claim.
Yeah.
It does not have much to do with fucking Marxism. It is a geopolitical argument about multiple worlds, and I think the fact that people think that this somehow will be good for, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting thing to talk about. I kind of just think like it's interesting to me because I think in the simple sense of multipolarity is obviously true. The absolute hegemony of the American empire is declining. However, in the reality, when I was talking to someone about this, I'm like, when did the hegemony of the American empire as a unipolar world existed for all of like fucking 12 years?
Right.
Well, yeah, and also like a multipolar world existed in 1914, right before the First World War. Like, it doesn't necessarily lead to anything that is that he's talking about here.
And also multipolarity being an opening for working class politics, socialist organizing, or whatever. That doesn't come from Dugin, right? Obviously, because he's not a socialist. That was grafted onto his multipolarity theory, like way later than that.
I will say I think that
Because
there's something to all of that.
His is like the new right. He's arguing from like a new right Alan de Benoit argument that what it's going to open up is pluriversalism.
Which, by the way, I want to point out for those of you who don't know your old right stuff, when we used to talk about racist before Trump just obliterated the need to hide stuff, the argument that was made by folkish heathens and stuff like that, often from de Benoit's influence, was human biodiversity.
Right. That's right.
And human biodiversity also is against miscegenation, because for some reason miscegenation is flattening and ending the diversity of the species, which is interesting because it implies that like whiteness is real weak in as far as like your genetic bloodline goes. But nonetheless, that was the argument. Now Dugin's moving away from the bio part, but the rest of the structure of that argument, and de Benoit also was not for the bio part, actually. So, but the rest of the structure of that argument is going to be maintained here. Like
Homo globo, right? You guys know about Homo globo?
Yes.
Well, yeah, we note a positive attitude toward the ethnocentrism, toward that type of existence, blah, 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 blah.
Right. So we note a positive attitude towards the ethnos, and ethnocentrism directed at towards a type of the towards that type of existence which is formed within the structure of the ethnos itself. Now, I don't know how you can maintain, by the way, what he said about racism and maintain this shit without admitting this is contradictory. Because isn't this well, isn't the evaluation of the ethnos as the locus of history a subjective assessment raised to the status of a theory?
Yes, indeed it is.
So, you know, it's just like I mean, to me, this actually gets into the same problem as some of the critical race theory stuff. But I mean, and I know people like, what? You are comparing Dugin to critical race theory? Yes, I am. Like,
you know what's so unfortunate is that like his arguments overall, they don't at all require that one really weak and stupid and easily pilloried argument about the real racism. So he's just.
It doesn't require a master race either, right?
Right.
No. Well, he doesn't believe in a master race.
No master ethnos here, right? So he can plausibly claim that his is a non-racist.
But he does believe that certain kinds of ethnos have to be wiped out.
Non-historic peoples in an Engelsian sense?
No. He thinks that liberalism is an ethnos thought.
Right, like we were saying, like Atlanticist thought.
Right. Which means he does oppose an ethnos. So again, no. There's a lot of like seeming to say, oh, we think all these things are equal, like good lefty. We believe in a world where everything is equally validated. The Islamist and the weird post-cultural person, you know, over here in broke down lands that need to be replaced and have national Bolshevism. But we're totally okay with that, except that when that ethnos is universalizable, are against prior ethnos. So if you try to change anything at all, you're committing a racism by saying that something is better than something else at all. Like that is the implication of his argument. So, I mean,
I don't even think it's a very like, it's not a hidden implication either. Like,
no, it's like
he kind of unfolds it slowly, but he does mean that very clearly.
Now, what is this for? It's basically very similar to in the aughts. Whenever and Chinese thinkers don't do this anymore, but whenever you like tried to criticize China on some kind of developmental grounds or something, they would just say like, you know, well, you were worse, imperialism, blah blah blah. And there's, to be fair, China's completely right. That's true.
Yeah.
At the same token, it's a tu-quoque argument. It's not a valid argument in the first place. It's a very morally appealing argument. You know, like, oh well, we're not doing anything worse than you did. In fact, we're way nicer than you. And in China's case, they're correct. Nonetheless, it's still an invalid argument. They don't make that much anymore. Actually, I've noticed a shift in rhetoric post G from like that to we are the same as, like, we want to be recognized in the same way as you and have an independent, you know, spheres of influence. And you've seen them pick up multipolarity talk, even on the Chinese side. Yeah.
Oh, just that. Yeah.
Is that how multipolarity takes on its like quasi-socialist valence? I guess it's the unity.
I think so. Yeah.
Of Dunism and Dungism, right?
Yep. And when you started seeing stuff, I mean, it I think weirdly came out of very Chinese influence, like LaRoucheism initially, but it's been like more generally growing on. It has been picked up by the Chinese right and center as well. I mean, so Alan Bloom and what's his face, Schmidt and
Carl Schmidt.
Yeah. Oh. And the another American guy who wrote
of right wingers in your head. You're going through the Rolodex right now.
Yeah, I mean, these are not obscure ones, these are more popular ones, which is why it's funny. The guy who Samuel Huntington, they are all read in a certain sphere of the PRC right now. I mean, like that's within the CPC. Now, since Chinese politics is way more regional and not really ideological, in fact, formally it's not supposed to be ideological at all. Like if you're not with the game, you're so rightist, regardless of what you actually are. There are divisions around this. If you follow different Chinese thinkers speaking at plenaries and stuff, and back when the Seneca podcast was around, they would cover this stuff. You could see there was a faction of the PRC around the of the CPC around the military that was reading a lot of Smith, Huntington, and not Dugin, but the battle of civilization kind of conservatism / sovereign exception / enemy distinctions, etc. in a certain faction of the CPC. It is not a dominant faction. It is not Xi's faction exactly, but it's not out of there. So multipolarity seems to have been picked up. And it makes sense because from the objective, speaking of like geopolitics, if you study international relations, we just are in a more multipolar world. My argument is like, fuck, we were for most of the 20th century. As soon as the Sino-Soviet split happened, we were in a multipolar world. And before that, we were in a bipolar world. The unipolar world existed, if it really existed at all, from 1992 to 2004. That's it.
I think it did exist, but it started to come apart in 2004. You're right. And I think for sure by 2008, it's over. It doesn't exist anymore.
Like, and it emerges, and it was, I think it's important to note, it was obvious to American thinkers from the New American Century, like, defector camp, but center-rightist.
1990s.
This was going to happen. Like, that there was nobody on Earth strong enough to be a unipolar power for the entire planet, even in a integrated market.
And
that was kind of what oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say one of the things that 2008 did is it stalled out maybe permanently and forever. I think like a Western centrist liberal conception that if there were to be two poles of the world, that the end of history would continue, but those two poles would be Washington, D.C. and Berlin, right? That the EU would become the sort of counterweight to American power, and that between the two of those, the whole world would be subordinated, but you'd have these two locuses of like quote unquote neoliberal power.
I think that's right.
Yeah. By the end of the 1990s, that had already changed, though. Like Clinton's already given China special nation status for a reason.
I mean, there's a reason why the global justice movement adopted as its slogan, "World trade is the enemy," because what it did is it kind of tacitly recognized that there was an epicenter of a dominance, and that was counter to what was perceived to be, let's say, local organic communities or whatever. There was a kind of a multipolarism at least in ethic that goes back 20, 25 years even.
Alter globalization.
Yeah. So to get back into this, well, no, alter globalization was a I would say it's maybe even more than multipolar. It's like a megapolar.
It's pluri-universalism.
Yeah, actually, it is.
Pluriversal. Yeah, that's exactly right.
All right. We note a positive attitude towards the ethnos, and ethnos are directed towards the type of existence which is formed within the structure of the ethnos itself. This is interesting because there's a lot of philosophical and anthropological movement going on here.
Can you break this whole sentence down? Because I'm not even sure I understand how deep.
We note the positive language for the ethnos. What is an ethnos? Now he's using ethnos, which is the precursor to race. One of the things you will notice is that when people translate ancient texts and want to make it about race, what they translate as race is actually ethnos. Now, what is an ethnos? An ethnos is defined by two things, a religion and a language. All right. It is not defined by a skin color. So a person could actually jump ethnoses through their life. Like you could become a Jew or a Roman.
Like you could become a Roman.
Parsi. Like, yeah.
It doesn't matter if you were born speaking German. If you began to speak Latin and you fell under Roman law, you were civilized and that was it. You were Roman now.
That Ramaswamy fella got in big trouble with the dissident right because he talked about that vis-a-vis Rome. It's kind of like pushing a civic nationalist assailants on ancient Rome, and of course all the real ethnos supporters came in and attacked him because that conception of ethnos or race is something that one passes through or a process of becoming, is of course allergic to much of the right.
Right.
It also
And
happens to be more accurate.
Right.
It is also like, you know, when we talk about this is where Dugin's trying to have his cake and eat it too. If you think race is socially constructed and not actually biological, which he clearly has to when every I'm just going to repeat it. Any attempt to raise a subjective assessment to the status of a theory is racism.
Just
Is
put
a
that one in the subtitle of this show. Just do it every once in a while. Essential.
Yeah, this is an interesting move, but it's one like in English are like 19th century writings when you talk about the nation and the race, those are both used to mean effectively ethnos.
Yeah.
And there's this weird sort of conflation in the 19th century, even in Marxism, between geology, biology, and language. All right. And it's a tension in Marxism. Like Marx is fighting it. It's kind of in the historical people stuff. When you get the ethnological notebooks, they move away from it. Like, but that's there. All right. And it's there in the debates around what is a nation, because it's tied into what is a race. By the time you get to the 1970s, in American thought, when you listen to someone like Jay Sakai, there is no distinction at all between race, ethnos, and nation at all. There's none. All right. So what is Dugin doing here? He's going to ethnos. Now notice he says ethnos and not ethnic, although ethnocentrism and ethnic is in there. Because in English, now this would have been originally in German, so this is a choice of the translators. But in English, you don't have to leave ethnos as its Greek root. You can anglicize it, because we have for 400 years, and say ethnic. But in American English, when you say ethnic, it becomes immediately clear that overrides and is often code for race.
Yeah.
One of the things about ethnos, if you read like Spengler or Evola and their spiritual racism, this is what they're talking about. Except it is unclear if they think you can actually convert to something else. And I'm not sure we're going to figure that out with Dugin either. But anyway, get back to this. Okay. So
I want to say it's very, very unimportant. I don't really want to dwell on it too long. But at some point later on, I would like to maybe do something about the misunderstanding and misuse of non-historic peoples, because I think I might defend Engels, despite him making an argument that I don't like. That's all.
Okay.
All right. Hegel brain. All right, we'll come back.
Hegel brain is exactly.
So, which remains intact through the various stages, including highly differentiated types of societies when many people may develop in the course of their history. I'm going to break this down because this is a mixture of philosophy and anthropology talk. Ethnocentrism is the idea that you value your own ethnic group first. Your circle of understanding and what you think of as a person is based on who you can communicate with, and that is based on language and symbolic kinship mediations. Now, Dugin's playing symbolic kinship mediations down because that rhymes with blood.
Right.
Which you have to do if you're trying to defend an empire, of which Russia, in all of its forms, is an ancestor of. There has never been a Russian nation state in any sense of the term. It has always been an empire. Now, I'm not saying that in the judgment sense of, oh, they're imperial. That's not what I mean. I mean, they're a multi-ethnic state. There has never been a singular ethnicity in the Ruski Mir.
Right. It could either be imperial or it could be plurinational, but that's it. There are only two conceptions of what Russia can be. Otherwise, it has to be broken up into, like, I don't know, 7 to 12 different ethnic states, which would be a disaster.
Which the Rand Corporation wants to do. So it's one of these things
where,
like
Russia, right?
Yeah, it's one of these things where today we tend to use nation and state interchangeably for reasons of nationalism in Europe. But as I've said many times, India, Russia, China, the United States are not, properly speaking,
Right.
nation states because they have never been composed of a singular ethnicity. Now, even if you argue that America is whiteness, it's never been one ethnic whiteness. That's why race became one of the more powerful for settlers than ethnicity and other forms of national identity.
That's
because
exactly right.
we were a plural national grouping. Like, and that's something to understand, right? So that's what's going on here. Now let's okay, but where's he getting this from? Because this first sentence I've read in an anthropology textbook. People are inherently ethnocentric. It doesn't necessarily mean they're racist. It just means they understand the world through the epistemic, cultural, etc. frameworks, the symbolic mediations, to use, really technical speech, and the thought worlds, to use Heideggerian speech if you want to, of a particular group of which you are belong, because it is in your language. If you take the strong form of ethnocentrism as inherent, you get to like Sappho-Rorphism and belief that language like changes the way you completely think about the world. And I think all that's wrong, but nonetheless, I do think language is a limit to the way you understand the world. So I guess I'm a soft Warfist or whatever, but I'm not a hard one.
I mean, I kind of, yeah, I'm a soft Warfist as well, because I think I can tell the difference between a person who speaks English as a second language versus a first language, and they'll even say like, "Oh yeah, I have to think about this in my native tongue," so then they'll think for a while, because
my personality
it
changes
comes
in
out
another
differently.
language.
Yeah,
Like when I speak other languages, I can't be the same kind of, like, I just don't have the way to express myself in the same way. So like whether my interpersonality has changed is a big question. I tend to think no, but like my ability to, like, for example, show certain forms of hostility, well, they just become more basic when I'm speaking another language. I can only really tell you, like, I can either like throw shit at you or be polite. Like that's what I like.
Throw shade.
Yeah.
Oh no, we lost Jason.
All right.
Hit his little thing. Let me take this opportunity to run to the restroom real quick. I'll be
Okay.
power out of it.
All right, back in. So we have this statement, which I said could be. I'm still breaking this down. We have a positive attitude towards ethnos. So we have a positive attitude towards linguistic, cultural identity, symbolically mediated. And a lot of America. This is not the language of American conservatives, but when American conservatives say politics is downstream of the culture, what they mean actually. The construction of an ethnos through a cultural understanding is more important than a political understanding. The Marxists go, those aren't separate things. Like,
right.
An ethnocentrism directed towards a type of existence which is formed within the structure of the ethnos itself. So it's taught to you. It's an internal. Now, you almost here get into like epistemic thought worlds. Like he thinks these are discrete and coherent entities. Maybe. We've already seen him bring up weird shit. Which remains intact through a variety of stages. So Russian culture was the same when it was Rollo.
When it was Muscovy.
Yeah.
When it was the Empire, when it was the Soviet Union, and now the post-Soviet. There's an ethnic component to that remains the same.
Well, and you hear this all the time. You hear people talking about the Russian soul all the time, and that's what they're talking about.
The Russian truth, the Russian mind, the Russian world.
Yeah.
And again, and it's just like many other things. I think there's even a little bit of something to that, but not even remotely close to what he says there is.
I think there's some continuities there for sure, but I'm not going to make a whole political theory out of it, right?
Yeah, I definitely don't know what I would base it off of. Because if you like saying Rollo, the Viking ruler of the Slavic peoples, is
Rorik.
Yeah. Rorik, Rollo, all those guys. They're the same guy. I mean, it just depends on what you're calling him. No, Rorik. Probably mystical people. The Kievan Rush, for example, are the same as the Novgorodians, are the same as the Moscovites.
I mean, if you want to put in, you could put it in different terms. And if you wanted to look at, at the U.S., you think about the relative degree of the Anglo Northeast versus the Celtic, Scottish, southeast.
Oh, Albion Seed. Yeah, that famous
It's-
book in the 70s, 80s.
There's a little bit of something to there, but I think you can make too much of it, and I think Dugin has done a good example of that, exactly making too much of it.
And a lot of liberals in the 2010s were doing the same thing. Do you remember the 7 nations thesis amongst liberals that like there are really 7 nations and it's based off this ethnic? I mean, it's also weirdly almost like settler blood and soilists. Like not that like not that we are from blood and soil, but we carry our soil with us. So the Scotch Irish are the same dicks that they've always been, and like they're unruly and. I mean, Charles Murray makes that argument too. Like
this can all have some plausibility and even some truth to it, right? I think that there are like ethnic things that are passed through time that do change, but some things stay the same. But we don't go around making political theories around that, right? We're willing to give culture its little place as it exists in the world, but like it's important for Dugin that this be the overarching right category through which we understand politics in the world.
Well, that's because we still allow for the mode of production as the central question, and we accept that history happens and has driving forces, and we can identify them. So all these other little minor allowances for partial truths are okay, but for someone like Dugin, it's like, well, that's all I've got, so I have to make as much out of it as I can.
Exactly.
Right. And then we see where he gets this from. And also, I'm going to point out that he hides that one of these people is a fascist.
Was it the I looked up this gentleman Wilhelm Mullerman, who managed to pass his exams when he became a Nazi.
Yeah, I mean Mullerman.
The other of them were Nazis,
but Mullerman and also Schmidt,
Carl Schmidt,
are Nazis.
Yeah.
They're not just conservative revolutionaries.
Well, and Arthur Mullen Vanderbroek is a clear fascist. He just is.
Yeah.
He wasn't a Nazi, but that's,
yeah. It was because he was a different kind of fascist. Like,
well, again, but he makes a lot. He gets a lot of mileage out of sometimes differentiating between fascism and National Socialism, but then other times not so much.
Well, but saying that someone's part of the conservative revolution is saying you're actually an anti-fascist. Because the conservative revolutionaries like as a movement, by the time that you deal, like the people who tried to kill Hitler the most
were, absolutely,
most were conservative revolutionaries. Like,
that's true.
Like the Marxists got camped too fast to do it. So, anyway, this topic found deep resonance in certain philosophical directions of the conservative revolution. Now, I've already had Jason and Chris were on for us to talk about that. We need to go into the conservative revolution in much more detail eventually.
Yeah, I think we should, but definitely with Chris because
it's literally his specialty.
I'm very much dead weight on that one.
Mm-hmm. For instance, Carl Schmitt and his theory of the rights of peoples, and Adam Müller and Arthur Müller von Denbroek and so on in the German School of Ethnic Sociology.
When I heard German School of Ethnic Sociology, I'm like, uh-oh.
A whole bunch of words you don't ever want to hear together.
Wilhelm Mullerman, Richard Thurwald, and others. And I mean, also we're just not going to acknowledge that Heidegger was a fascist. Ethnos is the greatest value for political theory as a cultural phenomenon.
As a cultural phenomenon, that's
as a community of language, religious belief, daily life, and the sharing of resources and goals, as an organic entity running into the accommodating landscape. Now, I want to say, so he moved from German reactionary sociology and German conservative revolutionaries with a few fascists stuck in there that we're just not going to acknowledge were Nazis. To actually fairly standard anthropology, right? This definition of ethnos is standard anthropology, an entity of language, religious belief, daily life, cultus. For people who don't know, culture and cultus actually are about stuff you do repetitively. That's where they come from. So the cult, that's what it meant. It didn't like cult as like a weird deviant group of people who use psychological control techniques. That's a more modern definition.
Yeah, there's biblical historians talk about the Jesus cult. You have the Mithras cult, where we don't even know what they did because they did it in caves, like underground. But like it was a repeated ritualistic gathering of a community of believers.
Now,
There was also
then
like
we
the cult of reason as late as like 1794.
Yeah.
right. So I want you to notice here a move, though, what he does. As a refined system for constructing models for married life, we got to focus on social reproduction, but not say we're doing that.
Before we go too far, though, I want to say the sharing resources and efforts does a lot of work here. I'm just saying, like, he wants to jettison class and class struggle and historical materialism. And all of a sudden now the economic life of a community becomes one of sharing resources and sharing efforts, right? Like, I feel like his organicist tendencies are just like in full bloom at this point.
Yeah, this is like I have to say, one, I was actually reading this, so I was like, so language, mediation of social world, religious belief, relations of power and production, which is part of the mode of production, actually, for people who miss that. It's not just technology, peeps. Daily life, okay, that's everything we fucking do. And see, cult. And then sharing of resources and goals or efforts. You mean political economy, right? That's what you mean? Isn't that what you mean? Because I believe that's what
that
you mean.
means.
That's
Yeah.
what that's how I understood it, right? And so the ethnos has its own sharing of resources and efforts. I guess it's like a collaborative process.
And in some weak sense, this is true in that different ethnic groups had different power relationships, which define their modes of production.
Sure, and they had different ways, for example, of like splitting up lands. There's like the Landtag among the Germanic peoples, and then there's like the Romans had different ones as well. But I'm just pointing to the contradiction here that we as Marxists would see all of a sudden now that the whole mode of production, whole political economy becomes in his ethnic reading like a sharing of efforts and resources.
Yeah, it is a compatibilist and a collaborationist model. As a refined system for constructing models of married life, that cough social reproduction, as always, unique means of establishing a relationship with the outside world. That is something I will just say, Marxist as a whole, we're shitty at actually making sure we focus on that. We just call that, usually we call it ideology, but we don't know what we mean when we do that. So like, ideology, the most abused word for Marxism that actually isn't even used by Marx that much.
Right.
But anyway, as a matrix of life worlds, that's Edmund Husserl, and as a source of all language games, that's Ludwig Wittgenstein, of the late Ludwig Wittgenstein, not of Tractatus, but of the notebooks, the colored notebooks. And I bring that up because, again, he's collapsing things. Like he's taking, you like Husserl, you like Wittgenstein, you recognize that they're not fascist, except when Lukács says Wittgenstein might be fascist. Wittgenstein himself thought he was a Marxist, but nonetheless, well, kind of weird Marxian socialist,
like a Marx-inflected person.
Yeah, like a Marx-inflected Keynesian, but nonetheless,
yeah.
And he was a religious mystic, probably. So, like, make of that what you will. Not that some of us have any problems with religious mystics. I don't think any of us have any problems with religious mystics. Anyway, so he's equating all these together. I have noticed this, and you know where I've also seen this in the past, and people are going to get mad at me again. Judith Butler does this shit.
Also a postmodernist.
By that I mean layering concept over each other by reference to names so that you assume that they're all referring to the same things. But language games are not about ethnicity.
Yeah.
They're about communicativity. Which is important for ethnicity, but Ludwig Wittgenstein didn't think about that shit. Like, not like that. Of course, ethnicity was not the focal point either in National Socialism or in fascism. Oh, it wasn't?
I think it kind of was actually.
It was.
There
There
was
wasn't.
a racial community, right? The
Yeah.
ethnic community.
Well, in fact, a National Socialism or in fascism, ethnicity was a big damn deal in fascism. And it was not always racial. Like, and I gotta say, we know that Dugin knows his fascist literature well enough that he does know this. That's something we can be certain of. We can
take him on that.
we can be like we cannot know if he actually believes some of the shit he says about American liberalism. But
I mean,
like
the only way that this sentence can make sense is if you really are going to drive a hard distinction, like dig a chasm which is unbridgeable between race and ethnicity.
Yeah.
Because the common understanding of ethnicity is very much the focal point of National Socialism.
Yep. Which okay,
And
go ahead.
No, and if we even want to use ethnos instead of race, right? Like what were the Germans? I mean, certainly language plays into it, but like there were attempts to find like an Aryan religion, like a unique Aryan religious expression in order to bind the national community together. Like even on ethnic terms, it falls short here, I think.
Right, and we also have to remember in the 19th century, like there was a British race and an Italian race, which means it was an ethnicity. So those words were still vague and interchangeable. It was actually in the settler colonies where the distinction between ethnic and racial really becomes clear, right?
Yeah.
So weirdly, Dugin's guilty of an Americanism. Take that. All right. I'm gonna hit him when it hurts. All right. This is interesting about Marxism. Marxist ideology did not pay much attention to the ethnos either, except for the entire nationalism debates and the nation debates. You know, the biggest question of 20th century Marxism.
Right.
And the derailer of every argument we've ever had.
Yep.
Like,
well, and also like going back to the 1890s, the national question was a huge one, which is incidentally why we have this troublesome category of non-historic peoples. That's how far back it goes.
Right.
Well, when I read this this particular paragraph here, I wrote in all capital letters, Lenin's nationalities policy, ... Stalin, right? Like what were they trying to figure out in the early course of the revolution was how to deal with different ethnoses, right?
Right. And specifically in the Russian context, which means that it should be very important to this book, but it's just not.
Believing that ethnos is overcome in a class-based society. Actually, no. I was actually saying that's kind of true. And I thought about what he's saying. No, he's not. No, that's not. We don't actually believe that. We believe that ethnos would, if you believed Soviet internationalism, you encourage ethnic cohesion into nation states so that they can join together in an international and some like dialectical twisty magoogie where like seriously it's like
power is shared but everybody gets a voice.
like the dialectical twisty magoogie here is like nations will make more of them and they will come together internationally and we won't need nations anymore. Like
the thing is like I'm sympathetic to that. I kind of find that to be right on, but it's also like I don't know how you can actualize that. It's just something you can hope for, maybe.
Right.
That's it.
Well, I was about to say, as resident Hegel brain, you have to believe that. That's
right.
Believe that though. You have to become an Esperantoist. Purged by Stalin in the 30s.
I mean,
I feel like there is a permanent tension between the universal and the particular.
Yes.
So nations and also, like the Soviet Union was an attempt, anyways, at trying to square that circle and didn't work. But I think it should be applauded for trying.
You know what? I'm going to say this as a person who's complaining about Hegel brain. It's actually glad that the most Hegel brain amongst us is here today, because what we're seeing and why we keep on saying, hey, this reminds me of this post-structural leftism. are this 50s liberalism and also what we're seeing here in Dugin is an attempt to excise both Enlightenment and German idealist thinking from this framework.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, you can start seeing like, well, everything becomes interchangeable in these weird ways, but also, but I mean, um, and there's no trace of it that remains in bourgeois and even more so a proletarian society. I think to defend Dugin on the second claim here, one, a proletarian society is only good in so much that it would be the way to abolish class society at all. That's the fucking point. It's not because we think workers are just cool.
Right. Yeah.
That needs to be emphasized over and over and over again.
Something somehow Dugin didn't pick up in the 1970s in like Moscow State University.
I mean, I wonder why. Like to be fair to Dugin as well.
Yeah, no, that's not on him. That's not on him.
I'm like, maybe there's a reason why his weird ass reading of
He wasn't reading Gilles Daudet, all right?
Yeah. Right.
No, he was not. I mean, I don't know who he was reading. Probably some textbook, but like,
well, yeah. By the 70s, there's no Marxist of note that's memorable
in the Soviet Union.
Absolutely.
No,
yeah, like at all.
No, I mean,
what's the need? You don't need them, right? There's no need.
It's kind of how you don't have Marxist of note that are memorable in China. I know this is gonna piss some people off after 1990. Like,
yeah.
Like, I mean, I'm sure some exist that are interesting, but in general, like the key Chinese theorists and divisions of Maoism are all from the 70s and 80s. They're
right.
not...
I think that's critical. I'm sure that there are some that exist that are very interesting, and yet there are none of note in the sense that of commanding a respect outside of very small intellectual circles in China.
Right.
Because
that's important.
It becomes an ideology of statecraft, and it becomes a theory of the management of conflict within society, and ultimately, and probably most importantly, a theory of political economic development.
So I'm gonna push back a little bit, and I would say I thought there was a possibility for the opening up of interesting Marxist thinking in the tensions that arose in the end of the Hu Jintao period. But Xi's success at consolidating different wings of China's contradictory society, which may be actually reaching an end now. I don't know. I'm not willing to bet on anything. I don't understand. I will admit, as much as I spend, the more time I spend understanding China, the Chinese left in the PRC, in the PCP, outside of the PCP, et cetera, the less I feel like I can generalize about a goddamn thing. Yeah. But
the more I understand, the less I understand,
Right. But I will say this, whatever Xi did, whatever, a fora that could have created a new, interesting, vital communist thinking out of China has more or less ended up with a weird mixture of third worldism and Dungism, two ideologies that don't actually work together,
at all.
But have emerged together in expatriate politics about China. By that I mean Chinese expatriates, not like us,
right?
And none of them are particularly interesting. So, like,
not at all.
I mean, the most interesting Chinese Marxist may be Dominique Lacerda, a dead Italian. Like, but to talk about, even though most of us are on team USSR and the Sino-Soviet split in the 70s, it is very clear that there was a vitality to Chinese communist thinking in the 70s and 80s that there was not in the USSR.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Like, without a doubt.
Like, if Dugin had been Chinese, like, and had come up like after the Cultural Revolution, I have a strange feeling his Marxism would have been better.
True.
Even though I tend to be Team USSR in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, it's weird. Anyway, to get back into this,
based on
So based on the guys, we're not gonna read everything, but I think this chapter 2 ends up being super important. So I can't really drop any of it. The only place, excuse me, based on the latter, the principle of proletarian internationalism becomes absolute. So proletarian, I mean, I do think that's true, but I don't think that means. I mean, like Dugin seems to think that means like cosmopolitanism or something. Like, I don't think that's what that means. The only place where ethnos received any kind of attention is in the dissident third way currents, which were rather marginal in relationship to the political mainstream, even though Nazi orthodoxy blocked the organic development of the ethno-sociological area with its racist dogma.
talking about National Bolshevism here, right?
Yep, he's talking about National Bolshevism. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's totally not fascist.
One more example of a really good time to just be a little bit more explicit. He would do himself a lot of favors.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
Or not. I mean, this is one of the things I'm like, who is this book trying to convince?
Right.
Is it trying to convince leftists or fascists? I'm not sure. Both?
I think it's both.
I think the
think
text
would
be sui generis.
Yeah.
Right? I think that he wants to pull the wool over the undiscerning reader's eyes and wants them to imagine that the fourth political theory is like truly revolutionary.
I mean, in some ways, this is encyclopedic and exhaustive. In some ways, we have to admit, this is partially Gish Gallop.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Because like when you start but I just want to, my sympathies to Dugin is like, we let a lot of theorists in the West on the left get away with this same horse shit, and I do want to point that out.
Because, we definitely do.
Because like rightists can come back at us and be like, well, you got people who do that, and I would be like, yes, we have a ton. I mean, like, honestly, this is more coherent than a lot of Zizek arguments.
I was thinking of Zizek specifically when you said that.
So all right, so we got crypto references to National Bolshevism. Although I'm with you, I don't know why he's crypto there but not in other places, because he is explicit in a few other places.
Maybe there are other dissident like 80s and 90s like
integralism would be one of them
that took place in Russia that we don't know about.
I don't know.
I kind of just don't really understand why be crypto about anything, because like the whole value of this, the reason why it's interesting, at least for me, is precisely because of how much it is directly influenced by a whole broad swath of thinkers and movements, and to hide those just makes me have to find out what they are.
But didn't it work though? Right, like synthesis of Dungism and to like post-fascism. Maybe part of the reason why it worked is because it was so crypto.
But what's interesting is it didn't work
maybe
originally.
So.
It did not work originally. Like when they tried to really push this on the left was like in the Obama administration, and it didn't stick. It stuck now. So,
yeah,
I actually think like when talking about how Duginism would have any sway on the left, some of it's like China. Yeah, sure. Although I'm not sure that's that many actual Duginists in China, to be quite frank. They just might pick up some vocabulary for instrumental reasons. And it's hard to know how influential Dugin even is in Russia. We've gone back to that. The people argue with me all the damn time about whether or not he's influential in Russia or not. This is like, to me, arguing about whether or not Alex Jones is influential in Russia, if Alex Jones also could be versed in post-structural theory. I mean, could you imagine Alex Jones quoting Judith Butler about frogs? I mean,
I couldn't imagine Alex Jones even reading one page of this and not just like having an aneurysm.
Maybe they're not turning the frogs gay. Maybe the frogs are interpolating gender differently based
on their ethnos. No. Anyway, whatever the case may be, ethnos and ethnocentrism, Wilhelm Millerman, the Nazi, had every reason to be considered as candidates for becoming the subject of fourth political theory. But we've already said they were kind of the subject of third political theory if you're not looking at Hitler.
Right.
At the same time, you must again and again pay attention to the fact that we do ethnos in plural without trying to establish any kind of hierarchical system. Ethnicities are different, but each of them in itself universal. The past, Jason.
Is that in itself
Wait,
universal?
What does that sound?
Are you hearing that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's a notification of mine. Let me shut that down.
All right.
Yeah, sorry, because you said something, Jason, but I don't know what, because all I heard was the beeping sound.
Sorry, guys.
That's okay.
We're leaving it in. All right. All right.
Off on that. That's the Telegram chat for the Independent Labor Club.
Okay. We draw many conclusions based on this point. We can relativize the very notion of politics, which itself comes from the normative values of a city, the polis. I was waiting for him to go Greek. The politics comes from a form of a particular life related to tribes as a root word. And consequently of the urban model of self-organization within the community or society. As a general paradigm, review what Richard Thirlwall called Dorfstadt, a village state. A village state is an alternative view of politics from the perspective of the ethnos, naturally but in balance with its environment. So now we have, why did all the hippies become fascists? No, sorry.
Why was Hitler a vegetarian?
Yeah. The view is not reflective of the city, projecting its structure upon the rest of the country, but of that of the village or the province. Notice, I will say, the sleights of hands with the oars are like this is a normal technique, but man, a village and province are very different things.
Yeah,
just want to point that out. It comes from the standpoint of those regions that have been peripheral in classical politics, but are the center for political theory. Aha! Re-enter Wallenstein. However, this is only one example of all the possibilities that open up if we accept the ethnos as a historical subject. But why? Okay, I have a question. If you don't believe in, and remember when I pointed out that he was conflating the political subject and the hermeneutic is also conflating the political subject and the historical subject. Now, us as Marxists also do that, but we're explicit in why we do that.
Yeah.
But he doesn't believe in historical progress. So what the fuck is the point of a historical subject if you don't believe in historical development?
It's its own self-expression, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
I kind of feel like he doesn't believe in progress at all times. Actually, it's in the next chapter. He talks about cycles and achieving balance. It's not quite a hard rejection of anything that's called progress at all, but it's the idea of progress. It is ongoing forever. That's the thing he has a problem with.
Biggest bourgeois progress.
Yeah.
So now let us discuss what is taken from communism, the second political theory. Yeah, you spent a lot of time talking about the
third,
how you're not the third, but also like weirdly you talk about ethnos in the relation to the third, which indicates that you kind of know what you're doing. First, however, let us decide what should be discarded in order to demolish its hermeneutic circle. And again, notice hermeneutic circle, the political and epistemic heuristic, is somehow the same as the subject of history, which is what human development would lead to a movement in social change, and the subject of politics, who should be a political actor as a collective, right? I just want to point out those are not actually the same things. They're just not. First and foremost, the communist theories regarding historical materialism and the notion of unidirectional progress are inexplicable to all purposes. When have communists outside of maybe the USSR in the 70s believed in a linear version of human progress? We believe in a weird cyclic but spirally Hegel form of human progress. Which
that's true, but also I think the vast majority of people who are communists around the world kind of have a liberal conception of progress.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
It's probably true. Yeah. Certainly, like the caricature of Marxism is all about like the iron law of wages, like a whole bunch of Lassallean shit that I don't think Marx.
Yeah. I mean,
Marx hated, explicitly
I actually
hated.
think there's a way there's a reading of the last century that you could see the stalling out of basically the Cold War paradigm and the victory of one form of liberalism over another one, because the tension between the two was not quite it wasn't quite understood in the right terms.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems as though the end of history has come. The dialectic is stalled out, but really it's like liberal progress is just interpreted by two camps. I don't know, whatever.
Liberal progress stopped itself, though. That's part of the problem that we're in right now.
Yeah.
But do liberals even believe in progress anymore? I guess
No, they don't. That's my whole thing. Is like
they do. They pretend they do, I suppose.
Well, but they do, and then disclaim it simultaneously. Like
I think they think that we basically have achieved everything we can achieve.
Yeah.
And the problems are just about maintaining, like getting rid of attempts to like turn back the wheel of time. But otherwise, like that's what it means to exist in the present order, is just to like tinker around the edges with the machine, which is basically right.
Between Dugin and Fukuyama, I actually figured out the decadence and liberalism in a way that is articulable. And by that I mean liberalism now doesn't have much substance except for the atomized individual as the locus of the social subject. I'm not even saying political subject, because political subject's just a managed, from a lot of liberal perspectives, a matter of policy or management or administration. Right. It is not actually a grand movement of politics. And I think that theory, and I actually do have to think about Fukuyama versus Dugin in my head and what that clarified about what they were actually saying. That like there's and this is in Fukuyama, it's the last man part of that. Liberalism has given up all the ghosts, but like the Nietzschean last man at the death of God. That's all that's left. And all that is mere individual, of which you have the infinite freedom of a mere individual. You are not a person constructed in relations. You are an individual who is acting to self-actualize. And that is all that liberalism really is now. The focus on identity politics as collective subjects are not about collective construction of individuals. It's about
liberation of individuals from the constraints of society.
Put upon them by people who are not like them. Right. They don't talk about the constraints put on them by people who are like them, because that would hurt their politics, so they ignore it. So I mean, but if you like that insight into what liberalism has more or less become and why, I mean, and for Fukuyama, that's why it's dominant. Fukuyama's not saying this is good. Fukuyama is saying, look, when everything else breaks down, the atomized individuals themselves to everybody.
Yeah.
Because you can see yourself in this Rawlsian paradigm where like, oh, if we're all equal individuals, I don't have to worry about these relations except in my personal life. And then again, they're about my self-actualization. So it's a narcissistic form of relation that has a certain amount of power, but it hides everything that constructs a person. All right. To shift my language deliberately from individual to person, because a person is defined relationally and through symbolic mediation and by their class. Those are the three things that make up our individual identities, and we have control over not much of them. So, so that, to me, that shows me the hollowed outness of liberalism right now. And that's tied to capitalism. Why is the administrative individual useful for capital? Because one, it hides class relations, because class tensions are part of the relations that create a person, although it can sometimes admit them. as something you can do to mitigate for individuals, not
Right.
for classes. So classism is a problem in a liberal left subject, but classism is the disrespect of your class position as a matter of respect of you as an individual.
Right.
It
That's
is
exactly
not a
right, right.
realization of class struggle or the fact that there's no way that these classes can be non-hostile to each other. They are about power relations, which are necessarily hostile. And the more obvious they are, the more hostile they become, which is the other thing in which Dugin reads more like a liberal who wants to hide these class tensions, or even a Marxist who wants to hide these class tensions. And believe me, Marxists, there are plenty of you who do, even if you don't admit it to yourselves. When you start nodding your head along to good old Sohrab Ahmari, who admits he's a corporatist in the sense of the word, and that he just wants the working class to be taken care of, but not to overcome itself. And if you agree with that, well, guess what? That's your actual politics, whether you like it in Marx masks or not. So this is where this is interesting to me, and I mean I find it interesting because I'm sympathetic to why Dugin is doing this, but I'm like, his version of Marxism is the corrupted, we gave up the ghost version of Marxism, and then he can't even talk about that completely. I mean, first and foremost, the communist theories regarding historical materialism and the notion of unidirectional progress are inexplicable to our purposes. We have previously talked about the racist element, which is embedded in the idea of progress.
Class hatred as racism, yeah.
Right, yeah. It is particularly revolting with historical materialism, which not only prioritizes the future ahead of the past, brutally violating the rights of the ancestors, but also
Equates the living human
society, Richard Thorvald, with a mechanical system operating independently of humanity according to the laws that are monotonic and uniform for all. Materialist reductionism and economic determinism comprise the most repulsive aspect of Marxism. You know, the stuff that makes it Marxist.
Yeah.
Although, to be fair, I'm also not actually a hard economic determinist.
No, or a materialist reductionist either.
No, but I actually have to point out to me that makes this Dungism, Duginism really fucking weird, because
it makes no sense now.
Yeah. The Dungist argument is an economic determinist developmentalist argument.
Yeah, the most clear economic determinists I've ever known are hardcore partisans for the Dungist turn in Chinese communism.
Yep. In fact, as much as they would hate it, they're going to really mad when I say this. Despite the Khrushchev and the later historical nihilism, the deviation made by Khrushchev that actually becomes a problem, even though I kind of like Khrushchev ultimately, is the same deviation made by Dung, which is developmentalism, not the independent functioning of the proletariat itself becomes the goal.
Right.
And that developmentalism becomes a model to spread Marxism, not through proletarian revolution, but through national revolutions of development against the West. Right? Like, that's where the shift occurs. It is a fundamental change in the orientation of Marxism that is so ubiquitous today that when I bring out classical Marxist texts about distrusting state relations or being careful about dealing with nations, they have no way to deal with it because it has been excised from their memory, even though it is plain in the basic text.
Yeah, you say that, and I'm going up against not up against, but I'm going to be on a panel with the Midwestern Marx people. So, and I wonder how much. I'm not a debate guy. I don't know how much of a debate frame I should bring to that whole thing. We'll see.
I tend to be. I tend to believe that debates are bad dialectics, and that what you actually need is subversive dialogics, which means really listen to them and bring out the contradictions in their own voice.
Yeah,
that is how you handle a thing. Like,
I think that's exactly right. I'm not a debate guy either.
No, I will only debate a person if they agree with me with 80% of my worldview.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I might actually with the Marxist-Leninist Dungus. I don't know. I don't know enough about it.
I Garrido in particular is one of these guys where I'm like, I don't know if we share a worldview or not. I am interested in his ellipses more than what he says. I'm interested in what he leaves out. And I'm gonna not go much into that. Although
this appears, you'll be able to probably watch the panel on YouTube.
Yeah.
What happened?
Also, if you want me to go into painstaking detail about that, there's a paywall series where I read every fucking line and reference of the Garrido book.
Which I'm gonna between then and now.
Yeah, that seems useful. Hey, by the way, I don't know where we want to try to get to a stopping point, because I think I have to have a hard out in like 15 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, Marxism is relevant in terms of its description of liberalism and identifying the contradiction of capitalism and its criticism of the bourgeois system, and revealing the truth behind bourgeois democratic policies of exploitation and enslavement, which was presented as development and liberation. Marxism's critical potential is highly useful and applicable. How can you maintain these elements of it while cutting out
historical materialism? Yeah.
Materialism.
Like the imminent nature.
They define the contradiction of yeah. I don't know, man. Like the things he wants to keep are actually dependent on the things he wants to cut out. I mean, I get his
use communism as like a fascist critique of liberalism.
Right. An arrogant contempt of the past, a vulgar materialist interpretation of spiritual culture, which, fair enough in Russia in particular. A focus exclusively on economic factors. Kind of fair, but not entirely fair. I think this is actually a point of apora and our seeming contradiction that doesn't resolve itself, an unresolved dialectic in Marx and Engels themselves, because they're very they kind of want to have their cake and eat it too on the separation of the economic and political post the development of bourgeois culture, and the fact that you can have a Marxism that basically defends anything geopolitically actually comes out of that apora. That's my reading.
I think that's right.
People call me arrogant for like critiquing Marx, but I do think no, it's just not worked out. And I do think they were trying to, but they didn't in the discussion. Otherwise, to me, it's like, why are there the problems of the internationals? Why, what was the whole it's just, we have to admit that something was unfinished there.
And we also have to accept that Marx and Engels did not see themselves as opening and then closing a system. They were just like, here's some ideas. Oh, and then now we're dead. Somebody else has to come up with new ideas. That's it. It's us that makes it into a religion. It wasn't them.
It's true.
So without these components, Marxism and more generally socialism ceases to be itself, and consequently is rendered harmless as a full-fledged ideology. That's why he's okay with National Bolshevism, because he thinks that Bolshevism is actually refuted by the national part of it. Dun, dun, dun.
Bolshevism is the expression of the ethnos too. I don't know.
Yeah.
Certainly liberal historians would argue that.
Well, he's also saying that Marxism is denuded of its power. When we get rid of the stuff we don't like. Literally, without these components, Marxism ellipses is rendered harmless. So take out the Marxism of the Marxism, and then it can't be Marxism anymore.
Yeah, can't do much.
All right, Marxism is relevant in terms of, we've already said that. Marxism's critical potential is highly useful and applicable. It may well be included in an arsenal of fourth political theory. Ding, what they're doing. All right, that's the tell. We are willing to use Marxism to undermine Marxism. That's stated explicitly.
Page 43, folks, in this edition.
Yeah. It may well be included in the arsenal of forced political theory, but if so, Marxism would not appear as an ideology that provides answers to a full range of emerging issues, answers that are rational and axiomatic in their foundation, but as an expressive myth or a witty sociological method, aka Sorelianism.
Aurelian Eric Wrightism is what I put in my notes with a question mark.
The Marxism which we can accept as the mythic sociological Marxism are what like Alvin Gudner would call the myth of critical Marxism or whatever. But this is what the MMTers accuse Marxism being, which it isn't, which is funny. Like when MMTers are like Marxism is lapsarian, and I'll tell you what, this is the reading. As a myth, this is from Dugin. Marxism tells us the story of an original state of paradise, primitive communism. Dugin really likes the crypto Christianity in Marxism, apparently, which is gradually lost, the initial division of labor and the stratification of primitive society. Then the contradiction grew, moving to a point when, at the end of the world, now we get Marxism as apocalypticism, we're reincarnated in their most. All right, wait. At the end of this world, they are reincarnated in their most paradigmatic pure form as a confrontation between labor and capital. Capital, the bourgeoisie, and liberal democracy personify global evil. Anti-Americanism of Marxism is useful because it is mythic.
Yeah.
Exploitation, alienation, lies, and violence, because it is basically the double. Labor embodied a great dream and an ancient memory of the common good and the acquisition, the surplus value by an evil minority. Evil minority stealing shit. I wonder where I've seen that. Gave birth to
more E.P. Thompson than it is Karl Marx.
Yeah. Gave birth to all the problems of modern life. Labor, the proletariat, must recognize the paradoxes inherent in this state of affairs and rise up against their masters in order to build a new society, a new paradise on earth, communism. Only this will not be naturally occurring primitive communism, but an artificial scientific kind in which differentiated, accumulated over centuries and millennia of alienation will serve as the commune, the community. In this way, the dream will become the reality. This myth fits neatly into the structure of eschatological consciousness. Yeah, it does. And that's when Marxism does this, I mock it for being that, which occupies a significant place in the mythologies of all tribes and peoples. No, it does not. Not all tribes are eschatological. Not to mention the highly differentiated religions. This alone speaks in favor in order for is Confucianism eschatological?
I don't think so.
Just asking.
No,
I don't think so.
I guess Dugin might not consider it a religion. To treat it with the utmost consideration. On the other hand, as sociology, Marxism is tremendously useful in revealing those mechanisms of alienation and mystification that liberalism uses to justify its domination. But didn't you kick all that stuff out?
Right, yeah.
As mechanical?
What does alienation and mystification mean for him?
Yeah.
In Marxist terms, he means it in his own terms, post-fascist terms, I guess.
Yeah.
I feel like what he's doing is he's going through the list of propositions that Marxism makes, and he says that is useful as sociology, and that's it.
Yeah.
So he doesn't throw them all out, even though he says we have to reject it, and then he comes right back and he says, but this is the way it's useful. He doesn't actually throw it out. What he does is he demotes it.
Yeah, to a sociology and a myth that is usable by the ethnos to fight liberalism.
So that everyone can make the Sorelian turn from Marxism to fascism.
Yeah, Marxism is often correct when it identifies its enemy, especially the bourgeoisie. Again, racism is anyway. It's however, its own attempt to understand itself led to failure. The first and most prominent contradiction of Marx's unfulfilled prediction about the type of society that are most prone to socialist revolutions. This is the whole Lenin disproving capital thesis. That's Gramsci, by the way. He was confident that this would take place in the greatly industrialized countries of the Western Europe. Well, which then leads to another problem, guys, which had a high level of manufacturing constrained and contained large proportion of urban proletariat. Such revolutions were considered impossible in agrarian countries, as well as those with an Asiatic mode of production due to their supposed backwardness. In the 20th century, everything occurred exactly to the contrary. This is the old critique. By
I
both
would take
Mhm.
I would take issue with both of those sentences, but it would take a whole other episode to explain why.
Yeah. Socialist revolutions and social societies developed in agrarian countries with traditional rural populations. I don't know that I would say that the peasants in the Bolshevik Revolution were traditional rural populations.
No.
While
It's
nothing
archaic in this version. Archaic
Yeah.
rural populations.
I also would definitely not say that the revolutions all happen in the East. What about, especially if you're taking the Soviet understanding of Marxism, that I think that means that you can apply all the Warsaw Pact countries. You can say revolution happened in France, just didn't take.
Yeah,
Really,
it happened in
revolution.
Germany didn't take, like, it's that they failed, but not that they weren't tried at all.
Right.
Like,
Well, and then it happened in Germany again, and it did take in half of Germany.
right.
So yeah, whatever.
As a result of a war. However, even in
Right.
those countries where socialism was victorious, Marxism dominated not allow for the rethinking of its basic logical assumptions. So to reconsider the role of the pre-industrial factors, or to honestly evaluate the real power of myths. So we should have been Sorelians, which I don't know what does Sorelianism lead to, Dugin?
This is another one of those points. It's like every other page, but like I think this is right, and yet I think I would say it entirely differently. There's a version of what he's saying that I think is worth dwelling on, but I don't think that he's the one to do it.
Well, I mean, I would say like Alvin Gudner's Two Marxisms is this paragraph, the book.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly. There are better ways to do this. For sure.
The Dialectic of Defeat is this paragraph, the book by Russell Jacoby. I mean, like,
Right.
the entireties of 70s Marxism and post-Marxism was basically trying to deal with this fact back when, Leninists used to admit that like they were actually changing fundamental premises of Marxism. By Leninists, I mean Marxist-Leninists. By that I mean Stalin and Maoist and Hojist. They were changing the fundamental premises of Marxism by moving the subject from the proletariat to the proletariat and the peasant to eventually the mass line. That there is a continual shift from. In the case of a mass line, I don't see how you don't just see that as a national subject.
Right. You go from like criticizing the concept of the people to utilizing the concept of the people.
Right.
Also,
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, we have. I don't know if we're at a stopping point, but I got to go. Like,
yeah, we're at a stopping point. So let us wrap up here, having not completed chapter 2. But God damn it, you guys are going to understand a whole lot of conservative, post-structural left, a lot of philosophy in general, because sometimes this shit needs to be explained to you. If you want to know your enemies, you have to actually know them very, very well, as opposed to like, it's something you can do in an hour podcast, I suppose.
If it took India and I almost a year to read Settlers, we can give Dugin some time too.
Yeah. All right. And on that note, we're out.
On the next one.